Hey everybody, welcome to DadsDen of Pop Culture, and we got a game review today, a game called Little Wars by H.G. Wells. Yes, H.G. Wells, the famous sci-fi author, was also interested in what we would now call miniature wargaming. In his day, when he was, kind of inventing it, would have just been sort of playing with toy soldiers. Now this is... the book was initially written in 1913, and obviously that would have been a larger book. This is a small reprint that I got, as you can see, with a foreword by Gary Gygax, introduction by Michael J. Varhola. But it has everything you need in it, and essentially what it does is it tells the story by H.G. Wells of how he came up with this game with others and worked through creating the rules, and then you get the actual rules to his version of a miniature war game. Now, this game requires no dice, does require some mathematics, but it also does require something that honestly most people probably don't have nowadays. And I did a little looking around, didn't find anything that was necessarily going to be a good replacement. So you'd probably have to be a little bit clever in order to play this. But let's open it up and take a little look. And it is nice. They do reproduce a lot of the illustrations in this book. And we see it is Little Wars, a game for boys from 12 years of age to 150. And for that more intelligent sort of girls who like boys' games and books. Yeah, it's a shot across the bows. But remember, this is also 1913. But let's be honest, most girls don't like this kind of stuff. And the ones who do are an absolute treasure to all of us nerdy guys. So we have Little Wars, including an appendix on Kriegspiel. Now, Kriegspiel was maybe what you could call the first modern war game. Obviously, chess is technically a war game as well. But Kriegspiel was created by the Prussians in order to sort of train their commanders, their officers, on warfare. And of course, it became something that people played for fun as well. So you get you get an appendix in here on Kriegspiel. You get the contents, introduction by Michael J. Varhola, foreword by Gary Gygax. Chapter 1 of the legendary past. Chapter 2 of the beginnings of modern little warfare. And that's where we're sort of getting, especially here, the history, the process of how he invented the rules for the game. Then we get chapter 3, the rules. Chapter 4 is an example of a battle. Chapter 5, extensions and amplifications of Little War. Chapter 6, ending with a sort of challenge, and appendix Little Wars and Kriegspiel. So let's dive into this thing. And we do get some reproduced photographs from oh so long ago. And here we can kind of see, and maybe I can get that a little bit closer, showing countries prepared for the war game. Now, when he says countries, what he means is like the country side. And here we have buildings, and we have trees and platforms to represent hills and that kind of a thing. So we're not going to linger too much on the introduction. It just tells a little bit about Herbert George Wells, the science fiction writer, and how he came to be interested in these things. Again, we get some great little bits of ink drawings in here. War, terrible slaughter. And think about how this game predates the First World War. And so a lot of, this sounds silly, of course, but a lot of the fun of war, the idea of it being of a lot of glory, of the color of the uniforms and the flags and the horse, the charges of horses and all that, a lot of that stuff really hits the skids when World War I comes along and just devastates the people that were involved with it. So keep in mind when you're looking at this that it predates that from happening. Now, obviously, wargaming has remained popular since then. It's just, I don't know, it's a guy thing. I don't know if we're training for something or if it just excites our brains to try to figure out how to outmaneuver an opponent and oftentimes roll some dice. But, there you have it. Does not mean, and honestly, he at one point in the book says, wouldn't it be better to play little wars than playing big wars in which nobody actually wins? So he's aware. He's aware of the devastation of real warfare and the separation between the real thing and the simulated thing. So here's our foreword by Gygax. Being offered the honor of writing this introductory piece was something impossible for me to refuse. Not only am I a fan of the science fiction works of H.G. Wells, but I am also a military miniatures buff, familiar with his wargaming rules, the material contained in this book, Little Wars. And of course he is, because, obviously Gygax is best known for Dungeons and Dragons, co-creating that game. But Dungeons and Dragons came from a set of miniatures wargaming rules that he did, called Chainmail, with others, I believe. And there was a fantasy appendix, and that fantasy appendix created an idea in Dave Arneson's mind. And, from there, we eventually get D&D. So Gygax and most of the early role-playing game folks were pretty avid in wargaming. One of the things that I think modern D&D players should probably explore, they would maybe understand why the game works the way it works oftentimes if they had more of a foundation in wargaming. This is written back in 2004. I'm trying to think when I first got this book, but probably wasn't that far from 2004, to be honest. I've had it for a while. And when I went looking for it on my shelf, in my mind, it was a larger book than this. So it took me a minute to find it. But here we have a nice image. This is outdoors. And he does talk about some of the difficulties of trying to play these things outdoors because, he's in England. So there's always the chance of rain or at least dew. And it would be, destroying a lot of these buildings and things that you would use. But you get an idea here of a grown man in, old-fashioned clothes with his straw hat, laying on the ground playing with toy soldiers. Some people will go, oh my God, what the heck? And some of us say, that is awesome. I mean, this is nerd history here. This is nerd history. It's important in that regard. So how does this book start? Little Wars is the game of kings for players in an inferior social position. It can be played by boys of every age from 12 to 150, and even later if the limbs remain sufficiently supple, by girls of the better sort, and by a few rare and gifted women. This is to be a full history of Little Wars from its recorded and authenticated beginning until the present time, an account of how to make little warfare, and hints of the most priceless sort for the recumbent strategist. Okay, so this little thing gives you just kind of an intro into the ideas behind Little Wars, etc. We get another nice image of a grown man playing with toys. The OGs. But here's where it really gets more interesting, is in the beginnings of modern Little Warfare, where he goes through how they developed the rules for this thing. The beginning of the game of Little War, as we know it, became possible with the invention of the spring breech loader gun. This priceless gift to boyhood appeared somewhere towards the end of the last century, a gun capable of hitting a toy soldier 9 times out of 10 at a distance of 9 yards. It has completely superseded all the spiral spring and other makes of gun hitherto used in playroom warfare. These spring breech loaders are made in various sizes and patterns, but the one used in our game is that known in England as the 4.7 gun. It fires a wooden cylinder about 1 inch long and has a screw adjustment for elevation and depression. It is an altogether elegant weapon. It was with one of these guns that the beginnings of our war game was made. It was at Sandgate in England. So, a big part of this game are these spring-loaded little cannon. If you're a kid from like the 70s and 80s, you're going to remember a lot of great, spring-loaded missiles that would shoot out of things. Now, sadly, a kid managed to choke to death on one of those. I want to say from a Battlestar Galactica toy. And that ended that. You didn't get those kind of toys anymore. But it uses a cannon, spring-loaded, that shoots a little projectile. And that is a fundamental part of this game. If you cannot find such a cannon, and I looked around a bit on Amazon, I found some very small ones that shot like a BB that would probably not work. I found quite a few that are designed for shooting firecrackers. And I don't know, that might actually work, but most of them seemed like they were maybe a little bit too large for the purposes here. Now, when I was a kid, we would sometimes set up all of our plastic army men, and we would take turns shooting at them with rubber bands, and whoever knocks over most of the enemy first wins. Not too different in concept from what's going on here. So rubber bands maybe would work, but you might have to look around a little bit. Maybe eBay has some old stuff, but it is a fundamental part of this thing, and it's one of the reasons you can play this game without dice. Now, there is what we would nowadays call melee combat in this as well, and that is mechanical. So he goes over with a friend playing with these toys, basically, and just basically shooting at little figures with these cannon, and he talks about a friend, Mr. JKJ. Now, Mr. JKJ, he doesn't, as the kids would say, dox him in this one, but that is a man named Jerome K. Jerome. Jerome Klapka Jerome, an English writer and humorist. And if Wikipedia can be trusted, which I know that's iffy, best known for the comic travelogue 3 Men in a Boat. Other works include the essay collections Idle Thoughts of an Idle Fellow and Second Thoughts of an Idle Fellow, 3 Men on the Bummel, a sequel to 3 Men in a Boat, and several other novels. So basically, he's a writer who was friends with H.G. Wells. He was one of the men involved in sort of inventing this game. And here we have a nice little passage about Mr. JKJ. He fired that day a shot that still echoes round the world. An affair, let us parallel the cannonade of Valmy and call it the cannonade of Sandgate, occurred, a shooting between opposed ranks of soldiers, a shooting not very different in spirit, but how different in results, from the prehistoric warfare of catapult and garter. But suppose, said his antagonist, suppose somehow one could move the men. And therewith opened a new world of belligerence. And I will say, this book is oftentimes funny. It's written kind of tongue-in-cheek by H.G. Wells. It's a fun little read, honestly. And again, if you're into war games, if you're into role-playing games, if you're into games in general, it's a book I would definitely suggest you take a look at, because it's fun, and it really gets down to the the history of all these nerdy things that we so much love. Well, at any rate, they come up with the idea of what about moving the soldiers? How would that work? And that sets them on the path to developing the rules. And anybody who's ever had to write rules for something will know that you come up with a concept, you play it out, and you find problems with it. And as a result, well, you make some modifications and you try that out. And what you oftentimes will find out is there's a loophole in the rules. You're trying to simulate reality, maybe not too, in too complex a way, but you're trying to simulate reality. And, but you'll find something where it's like, well, in reality, that wouldn't work. But in this game, it's like a surefire way to win. So it's them sort of plugging the holes of these things. So we get a little bit about them developing the battlefields and using, the different things that they need to do that. Obviously, we have the toy soldiers. This is actually a really good passage here. Improvement came almost simultaneously in several directions First, there was the development of the country. The soldiers did not stand well on an ordinary carpet. The encyclopedia made clumsy cliff-like cover, and more particularly, the room in which the game had its beginnings was subject to the invasion of callers, alien souls, trampling skirt swishers, chatterers, creatures unfavorably impressed by the spectacle of two middle-aged men playing with toy soldiers on the floor, and very heated and excited about it. Overhead was the day nursery with a wide extent of smooth cork carpet, the natural terrain of toy soldiers, a large box of bricks, such as I have described in Floor Games, it's a different book that he wrote, and certain large inch-thick boards. In other words, a lot of other stuff kids played with. But I love the trampling skirt swishers. In other words, you can imagine the long skirts that women wore back then. They're walking through the battlefield because most of us as kids learned Mom has like no respect for the amazingly cool stuff we would set up all over the floor of her living rooms. They would just tear right through like Godzilla and destroy things, but also the creatures unfavorably impressed by the spectacle of two middle-aged men playing with toy soldiers. So I love the tongue-in-cheek thing. And look, we get it to this day, obviously. A lot of us get made fun of for this stuff. And you know what? Over 100 years ago, it was the same thing. So we get a little bit about the methods of building the terrain. And again, if you've ever read like, any of the Warhammer books or almost anything on this kind of miniature warfare, you will get the directions on how to build the terrain and the scenery and do it properly. And here we get another nice image showing a country prepared for the war game. Very nice. And they obviously put a little bit of time and effort into this stuff. I guess if, you're a successful novelist and you have the time, you can do those kind of things. Of course, nowadays, you can buy a lot of that stuff that you would need. So here we also see a nice illustration of the little pegs being shot out at the little men. And he says here, we then began to humanize that wild and fearful fowl, the gun. We decided that a gun could not be fired if there were not 6. Afterwards, we reduced the number to 4 men within 6 inches of it, and we ruled that a gun could not both fire and move in the same general move. It could either be fired or moved or left alone. If there were less than 6 men within 6 inches of a gun, then we tried letting it fire as many shots as there were men, and we permitted a single man to move a gun and move with it as far as he could go by the rules. A foot, that is, if he was an infantryman, and 2 feet if he was a cavalryman. Now that movement basically sticks through this whole game. We abolished altogether that magical freedom of an unassisted gun to move 2 feet, and of such rules as these we fought a number of battles. They were interesting, but not entirely satisfactory. We took no prisoners, a feature at once barbaric and unconvincing. The battles lingered on a long time, because we shot with extreme care and deliberation, and they were hard to bring to a decisive finish. The guns were altogether too predominant. They prevented attacks getting home, and they made it possible for a timid player to put all his soldiers out of sight behind hills and houses and bang away if his opponent showed as much as the tip of a bayonet. Monsieur Bloch seemed vindicated, and little war had become impossible. And there was something a little absurd, too, in the spectacle of a solitary drummer boy, for example, marching off with a gun. So basically at this point, the whole thing is played with the guns, shooting the men with the guns and then moving the guys around. And he says, no, that's not really working. It's too much. And how do we, so you see, he's working out how this is supposed to go. And it is interesting here too, because what he's describing of the gun's ability to fire from far away, etc., and making a lot of the infantry movement possible, that's going to come true in just a few years in the Great War, in World War I, which is why these miniature games are sometimes very useful for figuring out how things might go, in the wider world. Well, he had a lucky break happen where he actually got to speak with a Captain M, again, not giving the last name, hot from the Great War in South Africa. That would probably be the Boer War, I would assume. And the Boer War was along with the Civil War, a kind of a preview of what was to come in the First World War. And so, but this is a man who actually saw action, and he kind of helped them out with a few ideas on how things should work. So they also discover we need a time limit. So there's a time limit now for moving all the men and shooting off all the guns. So you got to get busy. And more importantly, you need to know what you're going to do. So you can't just sit there and hem and haw about stuff. It's got to make the game move a little bit quicker. Always a problem in running games. Always a problem. So they have a timekeeper, and in the rules, he gives some ideas about how long you should have to move all of these guns. And the next big thing they came up with is, of course, the melee combat and how that was supposed to work. And so I think it comes a little later, but they do come up with rules for how you handle melee combat between the men, fix bayonets and charge. And it is mathematical. And as well, it involves capturing. And he says, okay, so we had these rules for that, but nobody was really using them because there was no inducement to do so. So they came up with another idea here, which was a scoring system. So now, if you're going to get points for taking your opponent's, guns and things like that, but you also get points for how many of your guns manage to leave the field of battle on a retreat rather than being destroyed or captured by the enemy. So all of a sudden, okay, now there's a reason to actually retreat if things are going badly for you. And the points also allow you to play like a campaign, several battles where you score up the totals from the different battles. Here we have another nice one. And this is, again, an outdoor one. They were usually playing indoors. This is the war game in the open air. And you see the one guy down, trying to measure out a shot to take out an opponent. We have a gun back here. And that also gives you an idea of the size of the guns that they're playing with. It's sad. These used to be very readily available, toy soldiers and guns. And now if we want to try to, duplicate what they were doing, it's a little bit tougher. Okay, so here we got chapter 3, the rules. Okay, so let's go through. We won't go in super detail, but let's go through the rules. So first, the country. The country must be arranged by one player who, failing any other agreement, shall be selected by the toss of a coin. So toss a coin and one player gets to set up what the battlefield's going to look like. The buildings, the hills, the forests, etc. The other player shall then choose which side of the field he will fight from. Okay, which induces the player who sets things up to not make one side of the field way better than the other one. Of course, it also means that maybe he's crafty and he makes one side look better when in fact it's actually worse. Ooh, that's a possibility. The country must be disturbed as little as possible in each move. Nothing in the country shall be moved or set aside deliberately to facilitate the firing of guns. A player must not lie across the country so as to crush or disturb the country if his opponent objects. Whatever is moved by accident shall be replaced after the end of the move. The move, after the country is made and the sides chosen, then, and not until then, the players shall toss for the first move. So again, we're tossing a coin, not a dice. If there is no curtain, what does that mean? Well, he came up with the idea during, talking about developing the game, of putting a curtain across the battlefield so that each side can't see how the other one is setting up his soldiers. Pretty good idea. But anyways, the player who wins the toss shall next arrange his men along his back line as he chooses. Any men he may place behind or in front of his back line shall count in the subsequent move as if they touched the back line at its nearest point. So when you're setting up your toy soldiers, you may need to put some a little in front of the others. But when you go from a move, you got to pretend that those soldiers are actually on the back line. You measure from the back line on that first move. In other words, you don't get an advantage by trying to set your guys forward a little bit. At least you don't get an advantage in terms of movement. And in truth, that puts them more in the range of the enemy guns. So it might actually be a detriment to you. Both players may take unlimited time for the putting down of their men. If there is a curtain, it is drawn back when they are ready, and the game then begins. And I got to think the curtain he's probably talking about would probably be like a rope across the, the room with like sheets hanging from it or something. I'm sure there wouldn't have been a genuine curtain. The subsequent moves after the putting down are timed. The length of time given for each move is determined by the size of the forces engaged. About a minute should be allowed for moving 30 men and a minute for each gun. Thus, a force of 110 men and 3 guns, moved by one player, 7 minutes is an ample allowance. As the battle progresses and the men are killed off, the allowance is reduced as the players may agree. The player about to move stands at attention a yard behind his back line until the timekeeper says, go. He then proceeds to make his move until time is up. I like that. And so we think of a lot of games nowadays as being maybe not a very physical enterprise. You're on a table, for one thing, usually. So it's easier to get to things, hover over things. And a smaller area. These are fought on a fairly large piece of ground. But you also, you're rolling dice for everything. And here, you're actually, shooting little pegs across the room, all that kind of stuff. So you stand back, go, and then you move forward and you set up all your guys. Guns must not be fired before the second move of the first player, not counting the putting down as a move. Thus, the first player puts down, then the second player, the first player moves, then the second player, and the 2 forces are then supposed to come into effective range of each other, and the first player may open fire if he wishes to do so. In making his move, a player must move or fire his guns if he wants to do so before moving his men. To this rule of guns first, there is to be no exception. So the guns do the thing first, you fire them off, then you get to move your guys. Every soldier may be moved and every gun moved or fired at each move, subject to the following rules: mobility of the various arms. Okay, now, one of the things he says is each player must be provided with 2 pieces of string, one 2 feet in length, the other 6 inches. Now, you'll remember, infantry can move up to 1 foot, so that would be that 6-inch piece of string twice. Cavalry can move 2 feet. That 2-foot string would be helpful for that. It says here, an infantryman may be moved, as I said, a foot or any less distance at each move. A cavalryman may be moved 2 feet or any less distance at each move. And then you get some rules on the guns, how they're moved, who gets to move them. Now, basically, infantry are going to move the guns slower than cavalry. And this is a big part of the game because so many of your opponent's men are going to be taken out with the guns that you do need to move them around so you could take advantage of how your opponent is moving his soldiers. If he's smart and he gets behind cover, the gun you have placed may be completely worthless to you. So now you need to have guys over there to move it around. And since the guns, like I said, are such a big part of this, there's a lot of rules. There's a lot of rules for that, for how that goes over. Because you imagine there were probably a lot of arguments involved. Here we get an idea of what these toy soldiers looked like. Here we have somebody captured. It looks like he's the captor and they're the captees. And here we get the hand-to-hand fighting and capturing. So this is a little mathematical, but it's not difficult mathematics, okay? A man or a body of men which has less than half its own number of men on its own side within a move of it is said to be isolated. But if there is at least half its number of men of its own side within a move of it, it is not isolated, it is supported. So we're classifying them here. Now, what does that mean? I got 6 toy soldiers sitting here, and they're infantry. I need to have at least 3 other toy soldiers within a foot of them for them to be treated as supported. Otherwise, they're isolated. You don't want your troops to get too far out, too far away. And think about this too. If you have a group of soldiers sort of in the middle with people on the wings, and that middle is taken out, some of the guys on the wings might suddenly be isolated, and it might really work against them. Men may be moved up into virtual contact 1/8 of an inch or closer. In other words, they don't have to touch. And remember, these are not like, Warhammer, you got the little bases, 1 inch, and some are larger sizes for larger figures. And you actually move them into base-to-base contact. You don't necessarily have that with these. Different shaped bases, so you don't have to touch them. As long as they're within an eighth of an inch, they're considered to be touching. They must then be left until the end of the move. At the end of the move, if there are men of the side that has just moved in contact with any men of the other side, they constitute a melee. All the men in contact and any other men within 6 inches of the men in contact, measuring from any point of their persons, weapons, or horses, are supposed to take part in the melee. So then from those guys within 6 inches of any of them, any other soldiers are part of the melee. So it's not just the guys in contact. It can be guys behind, to the side, what have you, as long as they're within 6 inches of any part of these soldiers. All right. If the sides are equal, so I got altogether 10 guys and the enemy has altogether 10 guys, all the men on both sides are killed. They're all gone. If they are unequal, then the inferior force is either isolated or, measuring from the points of contact, not isolated. That's where that isolated or supported comes in to play. If it is isolated, then as many men become prisoners as the inferior force is less in numbers than the superior force, and the rest kill each a man and are killed. Okay, so now let's say we got, I got 10 guys and he's got 6. So obviously you only want to go into battle, into contact, if you outnumber the enemy. And if you have guys who look like they might be isolated or look like they're vulnerable to a larger force, you might want to move them back so the other side can't quite get to them and therefore do that stuff to you. Okay, but let's say I got 10, he's got 6. The difference is 4. So 4 of his 6 are now captured. All right, we're not going to exactly take them off, but let's take them out of our brains for a minute. So now I got 10 and he's got 2. Those 2 are going to be killed, but they're going to kill 2 of my guys. So started with 10 on my side, 6 on his side. Now what we have is 8 on my side and 4 of the enemy are captured. And that's important. They are captured. They now have to be taken somewhere. You got to move them off the board, because if they are liberated by your enemy, they can rejoin the battle, but they do have to move backwards so they could rearm themselves. And that's all covered in all of this. Now, if the inferior force is not isolated, so that's if they're isolated. If they're not, then each man of the inferior force kills a man of the superior force and is himself killed. And the player who has just completed the move, the one who is charged, decides, when there is any choice, which men in the melee, both of his own and of his antagonist, shall die and which shall be prisoners or captors. So now in that case, these guys are now supported. I got 10, he's got 6. His 6 are going to take out 6 of my guys, right? And they're going to be taken out as well. So now, instead of me having 8 dudes and 4 captives, now he's got 0 and I've got 4 left. All right. So you want to keep your troops supported. You want to keep them near the rest of your army. You don't want to have guys strung out all over the place. It can make them easy pickings. All right. So keep that in mind. And then the other important point is the guy who has who just completed the move. So the attacker, we'll call him. He decides which of the 6, say of my side, are going to be killed. That's how I can make sure that, the people who are taken out are maybe, like, for example, let's say some of the dudes who were within 6 inches of the combat on the other side were manning a gun. I can decide those are the guys who are out. Well, now the gun doesn't have enough people manning it. It's not going to be able to fire. And you remember, you got to fire first before you move anybody. So I effectively have taken his gun out of action by deciding which people to take out. And likewise, on my side, I can make sure that I'm taking out people that are not going to leave maybe part of my force isolated. You know, I can keep the 2 guys who are closest within a foot of other troops and maybe take the 6 guys who are a little bit further off. You get the idea. So there's a definite advantage in attacking. It says all of these arrangements are made after the move is over in the interval between the moves, and the time taken for the adjustment does not count as part of the usual interval for consideration. It is extra time. So this doesn't count against the time you have in trying to move things around, all that kind of good stuff. The player next moving may, if he has taken prisoners, move these prisoners. Prisoners may be sent under escort to the rear or wherever the capturer directs, and 1 man within 6 inches of any number of prisoners up to 7 can escort these prisoners and go with them. So remember my first example, I got, 6 guys? No, 8 guys left. I got 8 guys left and 4 captives. One of my guys now can be detached. So now I got 7. He can be detached to take the little prisoners back to the back line and basically get them out of play. You know, you want to get them as far away from the enemy as possible so they can't rejoin the enemy forces. And I only need 1 guy to do it. Now, let's say I had taken 8 prisoners in what I was doing. Well, 1 guy can handle up to 7. If I got 8, that means I got to have 2 guys moving those back. So you got to think of that. You got to think about, you're going to lose some men as casualties, but then you're going to lose some men moving prisoners around. So you got to do a little bit of math in this thing before you engage. You want to make sure you engage in a smart way that's not actually going to kind of, mess you up. And so then he gives an example of how all that works, like I just did. It also says any isolated body may hoist the white flag and surrender at any time. A gun is captured when there is no man whatever of its original side within 6 inches of it, and when at least 4 men of the antagonist side have moved up to it and have passed its wheel axis, going in the direction of their attack. So in other words, they got to move past the wheels on the gun, and then they've captured the gun. Again, that's huge in this game. That is huge in this game, to take one of the enemy guns. Now you turn it on them and you start chipping away at his side to make them mathematically inferior to you so that you can attack and capture people. Okay. He gives some varieties of the battle game. 1 is the fight to the finish. You move in from any points you like on the back line and try to kill, capture, or drive over his back line the whole of the enemy's force. You play the game for points. You score 100 for the victory and 10 for every gun you hold or are in a position to take, 1.5 for every cavalryman, 1 for every infantryman still alive and uncaptured, 1/2 for every man of yours prisoner in the hands of the enemy, and 1/2 for every prisoner you have taken. So remember, he says an isolated group can just surrender. Well, let's say you had 10 guys isolated. Now, instead of the enemy attacking and wiping some of them out, right? If all 10 of them are now captives, well, for one thing, the other guy now has to devote, a couple guys to escort them. But it means you're going to score a 0.5 point for each of those guys. On your side, you get a 0.5 point for all your guys who were captured rather than killed. So there's a reason to actually, give up. You get 5 points for those guys. But if they're taken out, or if most of them are taken out, you don't get as many points. It says, note, this game can be fought with any sized force, but if it is fought with less than 50 aside, the minimum must be 10 aside. So there are limitations to how that will work. There's also a blow at the rear game, where you try to get your guys to the back line of your antagonist. The defensive game, a force the defenders 2/3 as strong as the antagonists, tries to prevent the latter arriving, while still 1/4 of its original strength upon the defender's back line. So there, you're trying to protect your back line. You want to have at least 1/4 of your men left, and then you kind of win the game. Now we get composition of forces, and here it also kind of gives point values for them. If you play modern war games, you're going to understand the idea of points for soldiers. Now, of course, with these games, all the infantry and cavalry are essentially equal. The only thing the cavalry has going for it is it's faster, but one infantry can take out one cavalry, with no problem. So you don't need to have different point values so much, again, outside of the cavalry being faster. But it's not like, say, again, I use this example a few times, like Warhammer, where, there's elite troops and there's this, and then there's monsters who are worth more. It's basically the same point values on both sides. You get the size of soldiers. The soldiers used should all be of one size. The best British makers have standardized sizes and sell infantry and cavalry in exactly proportioned dimensions, the infantry being nearly 2 inches tall. There is a lighter, cheaper make of perhaps 1.5 inches high that is also available. Foreign-made soldiers are of variable sizes. So in other words, all your guys need to be the same size, and it gives you an idea. Well, it gives you an idea of the kind of soldiers, toy soldiers that he's talking about. Could you play this with little green army men? I think you could. Depending on what you're using for cannon and shooting little pegs around, they might be a lot easier to take out than metal army men on their little bases. So something to keep in mind. It might be a bloodier affair if you're using, little green army men, or, just plastic soldiers of any kind. So something to consider. Maybe instead of a wooden peg, you would fire something a little bit lighter, And he does go over rules of like, when does it count if a soldier is knocked over but is supported by another soldier? If moving that other soldier would make him fall, then he counts as taken out by one of the shots. If he's just a little off, but he isn't going to fall over on his own, then he's still around. Okay. Chapter 4, the Battle of Hook's Farm. And this gives you the example of a larger battle that was fought, so you see how the thing works in practice. And again, it's kind of funny the way that if you read a modern day war game set of rules, aside from having sort of the history of how the rules were developed, you're going to get almost exactly this kind of format. You're going to have maybe a little introduction, and then you're going to have, here are the rules, and we're going to go through the different phases of the game and how it works, and then we're going to have a sample combat for everybody. It's nothing revolutionary, but this is the first time it's done, and basically, he's already got the format right. You don't look at this and go, well, we'd never write things this way nowadays. Yeah, you pretty much do. So we do get a map for this one of the battlefield with the cottage, with the, what does that say? Firefly. Firely Church, the trees, etc., and Hook's Farm and all that kind of stuff. And you get an idea of the composition of the forces. And we do get a few more images here. And here you can see again, these are the cannons that we're talking about. If these little soldiers are about 2 inches high, then you can sort of figure out about how long these cannons are. Let's see, about one. They're probably about 4 inches, 4 or 5 inches long from the tip of the little hook. I don't know what you'd call that. I can't think of the word, to the tip of the cannon. So just to get you an idea of how this stuff works out. And here we got another image of Hook's Farm. And so he kind of tells the whole thing, how it works, and the moves made by each side, and the ones that work and the ones that don't, and the failures. And they kind of refer to it as the blue side and the red side. Again, I love the little illustrations. And those are from the original book. I don't know what one of these original books would actually cost you if you were trying to find it. They could be rather expensive at this point, but that would be a neat thing to have. So we're not going to go super into how this works. But it's a fairly long description of the battle. So, again, this is like a book that people are going to pull out of a bookstore, and then they got to take it home and figure out how it all works. So giving a pretty detailed account of it is a good idea, since it's not like people can download YouTube videos, or maybe people wrote letters to H.G. Wells with questions. It's possible. But now you also get this extensions and amplifications of little wars. And so he comes up with stuff like cavalry scouts, using boxes to hide how many troops are here or there, so the other side can't immediately see it. I guess until it's their turn and they're firing. Maybe they'll forget how many soldiers there are, so they can't count it up and do the math. He goes into some stuff about, wouldn't it be cool to have a really large space and have several players on each side who would have the time to move men around, so you could do a really massive sort of battle. And that kind of comes down to his sort of challenge. His challenge is, dude, let's all learn this game and have a huge battle. That is such a nerd thing. Such a nerd thing. Oh, look at that. We got a little airplane in here. How would the airplanes work? Well, I guess you could figure it out one way or the other. And then, of course, at the very end, you get some ideas about the Kriegspiel game and Little War and how they would work. He says, I am particularly indebted to Colonel Mark Sykes for advice and information in this matter. So, well, I think, again, wargamers, especially from the old days, who, they had newsletters and letters would go back and forth and people would get together at conventions, will remember this kind of thing. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. So they give you ideas for rifle fire, how that would work. Larger battles, again, they talk about a little bit. You just get the idea. It sort of expands things. So, like, for example, now as to the moves, it is suggested that infantry shall move 1 foot, cavalry shall move 3 feet. The above moves are increased by 1/2 for troops in 2s or 4s on a road. Royal engineers shall move 2 feet. Royal artillery shall move 2 feet. Transport and supply shall move 1 foot on roads, 1/2 foot across country. The general shall move 6 feet per motor. So now we're bringing motorized vehicles into things. 3 feet across the country. Boats shall move 1 foot. In moving uphill, 1 contour counts as 1 foot. Downhill, 2 contours count as 1 foot. So again, this is taking the Kriegspiel rules, which are maybe a little more complex, and applying it to Little Wars. There's stuff about passing a fordable river, how much that, takes from your movement. So you get the idea here. It just complicates things if you want a more advanced version of the game. All right. Supplies in the field. I love this stuff. It's fun. That's the fun of building these rules and learning these rules. If you look at like early Dragon magazine, you can find, PDFs of that online. I guess back then it was called The Dragon. You can see that they've got this new toy to play with called Dungeons and Dragons. And all the articles are like, here's something cool we could do with it. Here's something new. Here's something, everybody's jumping in. Now, eventually it becomes less sort of creative and more about, we need to standardize this thing. We need to make this more realistic. But the initial stuff is all about, here's all this wild, wacky, cool gonzo stuff we could stuff into this game. Let's have fun. And you kind of get that here. Now that we got the basic game figured out, what else can we do? What new things can we add to it? And there you go, folks. That cost me $10. This is Little Wars by H.G. Wells with an introduction by Michael J. Varhola and a foreword by Gary Gygax. Great little size. It has everything you need. It'd be really cool to get a larger size, maybe, so you could see the pictures better, whatever. And it'd be kind of cool to have one of the original printings of the book as well, just for the historical value. But it's a great little pocket-sized book with wargame rules in it for you. Now, what could you do with this game? Well, nowadays, we tend to enjoy rolling dice. Could you put a dice rolling element into it? Yes, you could. And in his history, he talks about doing something like that at one point. Where basically somebody managed to get a massively lucky number of rolls, and it really swayed a battle. And they're like, nah, we're not satisfied with that. And of course, I think a lot of modern people would be like, no, that's way better. Because there is sort of the vagaries of war. Anytime you're rolling lots of dice, here we're talking like 6-siders. Anytime you're doing that, the mean is going to be about 3. the average is going to be about 3. So if you manage to roll a big wad of dice and get a lot of 6s and 5s, well, that's cool. That's luck. And that's something we find fun. Could you adapt this to use dice? I think you could without a whole lot of trouble. You'd still probably want to keep the little cannons shooting things back and forth. And speaking of those little cannons, kind of reminiscent, this game, of Crossbows and Catapults. How many other 80s kids remember Crossbows and Catapults? Now, I think they came up with a very similar game with a different name later, some years later. But that was, you had the barbarians versus the Vikings, and you had little miniature figures, and you had these plastic blocks you'd use to build a fortress, and little plastic crossbows, 2 of them on each side, I believe. Maybe 1 on each side, and a plastic catapult, and you shot these little, I don't know what you'd call them, these little pieces back and forth at each other, trying to knock down your opponent's walls or take out their troops, what have you. If you could find some of those powered by a rubber band, maybe you could use something like that in a game like this. Maybe you could use something like that in a game with medieval miniatures. You see the idea. You could adapt this and have a lot of fun with it. So, Little Wars from 1913 by H.G. Wells. Highly suggest if you're into, look, if you're really into wargaming, you've probably read this and you probably have a copy. But maybe you haven't. Maybe you're newer to these things and you haven't heard of this before. I would suggest going out and trying to find a little copy. Very fun little read. Like I said, at least, especially in the introduction and during the description of the battle, it's done in a humorous way. It's fun. Now, it's a little wordy because of the time it was written in, but I think we can all handle that. And but a good writing style from H.G. Wells. It's enjoyable. Hey, let's be honest. His sci-fi sometimes was a little rough and a little bleak, but this is the fun side of H.G. Wells in this thing. So I highly suggest you go out and get this. But if you're just interested in maybe role-playing games, or hell, just in history, this is a nice little historical document. And I think it also brings you closer to somebody who lived, or at least was writing this more than 100 years ago. When you read about his what he's trying to come up with and, annoying his wife that he has toy soldiers all over the carpet and things like that, we can go, oh man, nothing's changed. Nothing has changed. Hell, if you're a video game player, we all know there are wives who get mad because you're playing too many video games or you're spending too much time doing it. It's an ancient thing. I'm sure 500 years ago, men were doing things that were getting on their wives' nerves. And it's like a rite of passage for all of us, but especially all of us nerdy guys who like to play with action figures and toy soldiers. So there you have it, folks. Love this book. Highly suggest you get it, read it. And you can, by the way, find like PDF copies online. They're out there. And I actually, to prepare for it, I listened to an audio version that I found on YouTube just to help refresh my memory about a few things. So you can find it that way as well and just take some notes. Again, the rules are not really complicated, which is one of the nice things about it. But let me know what you think of Little Wars. Maybe you've actually played it. I never have. I want to, but I'd have to assemble everything first. And God knows I don't have a lot of time to do that, but I'd love to play it. But if you played it, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear about how it went. And was it fun? Were there problems with it? What rules did you modify to make it better? I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this little review, please give it a like, maybe subscribe, maybe share with a friend. But until next time, God bless everybody. Please be kind to one another. Have a little bit of fun out there. And I will see you hopefully again soon in Dad's Den of Pop Culture. Bye-bye.